Good afternoon and welcome into the Takeup. Today we have episode 196, The Mistakes We Keep Making, Perennial Digitizing Problems. Good afternoon, folks. Sorry for the slight delay. As you might know, the world of everything online today has been a little funny, and I don't seem to be having any better luck than anybody else. For some reason, some of my social media streams got hung up and badly scheduled. The schedule wasn't working correctly. So if you are not seeing me in the place you usually think you are supposed to, I understand that now. If you had some trouble getting in, I'm sorry. I will still go ahead and put on the best show I can, despite having spent a lot of my prep time today, honestly, dealing with technical difficulties. Unfortunately, that's just something that happens, and you can't really help but have issues with that when it does happen. Suffice it to say, we're still going to have some stuff we'll get to talk about today. And as we can see from the big skull and crossbones here, we're talking about pitfalls. I always put this thing up, and quite funnily so, because I usually throw it right in front of my face here, which funny enough hits me right in the camera, the big skull and crossbones. So I don't mean to be wearing that mask, but yeah, this is those pitfalls, the stuff that we keep doing wrong, the mistakes that we keep making over time, and the things that even seasoned digitizers seem to do. And that's the thing. I think that this is not necessarily going to be the longest show or the craziest show. I hope you guys will ask questions and offer your own opinions here. But as I got to do the show earlier for the Two Regular Guys, if you don't know, I am a producer of the Two Regular Guys podcast. And on the earlier podcast today, I talked about what people should think about as they're getting into digitizing. And I thought, as a great bookend to that, as we're talking about helping people avoid the mistakes that they make when they're first getting into digitizing, I thought it'd be worthwhile to say, hey, folks, these mistakes, some of these mistakes continue to happen, right? They continue to be things that we find ourselves struggling with. And I'll show you some examples of stuff if I can. Like I said, had some definite issues getting online today. But luckily, it seems like we are on, we're running, and hopefully we can have a good discussion anyway. If nothing else, if you have questions, if you have comments, and you guys are live, I would love to hear from you. Otherwise, we're really going to stick to this topic of what are the things, the mindset things that kind of bother us over time that continue to be problematic. And I'm going to talk a little bit of my own personal experience, as well as the things that I coach other people on, the problems that they have over time. And frankly, it's not surprising to me that I do get the same questions. People ask, like, oh, are you tired of teaching the same classes over and over? Are you tired of continually having to show people the same stuff? And frankly, not really. The truth of the matter is, most of what we are doing, most of what we are likely to do, is going to be the same. What we're doing as digitizers, what we're doing in general, these perennial problems, they keep coming up because most of what we do, most of our technology actually isn't very different, right? Most of the stuff that we're actually working on is going to be similar. Logos haven't changed much. If I look at the stuff that's up here, even when the art changes, even when there's different stylistic cues, we've gone a long way from the early and late 90s where I kind of came on, and there was tons of people doing swoosh logos that had ridiculous swoosh shapes on everything. There was an arc or a swoosh or a line showing motion on everything, where we use the same fonts for everything because everybody had the same desktop publishing 10 fonts that Microsoft had said were worthwhile. Everything was in Times New Roman and Impact. The art has changed, but if you think it's largely different for me to digitize the fonts that were popular then from the fonts that are popular now, that's not necessarily the case. Are there advances? Absolutely. There's tons of advances. There are things that we do differently. And like I said, I may pull some stuff up. Certainly, technologies change, though, as we've seen, sometimes new technology have hiccups. If you guys haven't noticed or didn't see the news about it, Color Reel, the technology used to dye thread on the fly so that you can get all those crazy gradients in your fills and what have you, those guys just filed for bankruptcy because they kind of couldn't find their feet. The things that we do are perennial themselves. So yeah, there's perennial digitizing problems, which I'm going to go ahead and throw up here. Yeah, we've got perennial digitizing problems. Perennial meaning they keep coming back year after year, like a perennial plant. But the thing is, that's because the essence of what we do is very similar. And as new people enter the space, they're going to have these problems. And frankly, as we relax into our roles as digitizers who've been around for a while, we're going to have some of those problems again, too. Like, it's easy for us to relax into the abilities we have, relax into the types of things we do frequently and just make those problems again. It's something that's pretty frequent for all of us to do. It's hard not to relax into your position and just do that kind of work. It's not something you should necessarily feel bad about. It is something that you should understand is common and is something that you have to check yourself on occasion. So we'll talk about that. But if you have stuff that you think is part of that list for you, I would love to hear from you guys too. But for right now, I'm going to say hi to some of the folks who are here live, as I always do. If you have anybody who you think would benefit from this, I would love for you to share, especially today where some of the streams got destroyed. Please feel free to share wherever you can if you would like to. Otherwise, I will talk to you guys and give the people who did manage to get here the best show I can anyway. Suffice it to say, we have Cindy King coming in from Texas. Good afternoon, Cindy. Happy to have you in. Susan says hello. Hello, Sydney. Vi in LA saying great topic. Glad to hear that. If, like I said, if you have stuff you want to contribute or questions or comments, by all means, let's get to them while we're here today. Barb saying, good afternoon, everyone from North Central Minnesota. Happy to see you in as well. Gail from Kingsbury is in. We've got Jesse, who always watches on the replay. And by the way, comments. And thank you so much for commenting and saying, good replay. That's something to me. All right. That means something to me and it means something to the algorithm. So it's always lovely to see. I know I'm a small channel for a lot of pro digitizers and folks who get really deep and into the weeds. But it does mean a lot when you guys engage. So I really appreciate that. Love seeing you guys talking to each other as well. DJ Kev coming on, which by the way showed up this morning for two regular guys. Thank you for being with us today, DJ Kev. Love it. Hello from North Carolina. So represent North Carolina. Love to have you in. We've got everybody talking. Love Cindy King's just like, yep, we got. She's looking at my skull and crossbones that I threw up there. Yeah, folks. It doesn't mean I'm not condoning piracy. I'm saying these are pitfalls. And in fact, that's one of the pitfalls people ran into with this software stuff. Anyone who had a software that happened to have online registration where it checked online to make sure you were on it and gave you back the registration file to run your software. A lot of people had an unexpected day off today. And that's just something that happens sometimes, folks. But yeah, it means we got to prepare and communicate with folks. All right. Love to see everybody saying hi. Everybody's talking to each other. Steve saying hi from Iowa. Thank you for saying hi, Steve. All right. With everybody in, let's get into it, right? Let's talk about some of this stuff. So perennial digitizing problems. What are the things that I continually see people fighting with, day in, day out, year in, year out? And some of these things are pretty similar, right? Like I said, this is something where I don't think we'll have to go too deep into any of it necessarily, but we will talk about kind of the ways people fall down as digitizers. And the one that sometimes people wouldn't expect me to hit as hard as I do is actually the one that I've taught several classes on that are outside of the realm of digitizing in and of itself, and that's communication. One of the things digitizers do, especially as digitizers relax further into their role, as digitizers become more stable and feel more kind of possessed of themselves, is you get to this point of thinking, hey, my customers understand me. My customers know what I do. They know what I'm about. I don't really have to get approvals. I don't have to work on the workflow for my information. You know what I mean? Informational workflow. So how do we get approvals through our system? How do we talk to people? What are we doing with that? And I think that's the thing. Sometimes people do not really think about that enough, and it can be problematic. So I'm going to share some stuff on my screen as we go through it, and I'll talk about the old school and the new school and kind of how things work. But suffice it to say, a communication is one of the most important things. If you're a commercial digitizer, or even if you're making something for somebody and you care what they think about it, you need to communicate with them. And the funny thing is, all the technical stuff we talk about, like we get into small lettering, we get into blending, we get into how large a design can be in general, we get into shading and detail and positioning on a garment, and how do we get something close to the brim of the hat? All of the stuff that we talk about, there's a certain amount of it that really is all about the communication, understanding what's important to someone. So I'll throw some stuff on screen and we'll just talk around this concept of communication, because though I'm going to get further into the digitizing part, and I know lots of us are thinking, hey, we don't necessarily want to listen to you just talk about business stuff today, Eric. We're going to get some digitizing in. We will. But here's the thing. Back in the day, we started out processes like this. You had what we call a job jacket or something of that nature, and you would end up where you're just writing down the information that's going on. We're doing interviews personally. And I think what we've probably gotten to a point of right now is when we start having this order form online, when we start having these order forms in such a way that they're automated, we don't get to ask more kind of detailed questions. Sometimes you're talking to a customer and you're like, I need to know what's important with you. And sometimes this stuff can be offered to us because if we have things like style guides, I'm going to show you guys this again. If you have a style guide for a big corporation, it's easy to have these questions answered for you. You're like, what do I do if I'm on a busy background? What colors am I supposed to use? What fonts am I allowed to use? How far away does the title go from the design? Things like that. That stuff is all that stuff can be in a style guide. And that can be an informational workflow pretty simply. The problem is when you're talking to a customer, you might not know exactly what that is, and you might not be able to talk to them about that. And then the other thing people do is they don't get approvals. And here's an online approval from a fairly modern system. Even with an online approval like this, it's so critical that we talk about things like this, what the actual size is going to be, the fact that colors aren't 100%, and talk to people about what's important. This Pepsi balloon design, it's pretty simple, but it was done off of a piece that was half photographic. It was a bad photograph. Certainly the actual design looks a little better, as you can tell, than the digital. Here's the actual design again that was on that order form. You can see the shading that's done in there. This design could have been rendered different ways. If the customer wanted something fully graphical that had no shading so that they didn't kind of have the grayness around the balloon, that's something that they could have asked for. That's something that we could have done. The only way to know this, when someone brings you in like photographic source, I know you guys have seen me talk about like Mark's Crane, and I'll bring that up because that one's here. And I talk about this piece pretty often because it was a big piece that turned out well and turned out to be a big moneymaker for my company for a while. Though this is what I ended up with, it started out with a photograph of a crane, right? So it started out with a completely photographic representation. I can't know how important that representation is or what they want out of it without talking to the customer. And also, even with simple stuff, you look at the logos that are on the wall of shame behind me, sometimes things like color, positioning, small changes to fonts or layout, digitizers can get lazy or get complacent and think, I'm going to make some changes. The customer knows that I make these kinds of changes all the time. I'm just going to run it. I'm going to throw it to production and not deal with it. Or the other way around, you'll do something that's too hard, that really does not work, that isn't physically suited to embroidery, something that we're going to talk about in the other kinds of things that mistakes we keep making further on. And you didn't need to because you cut out the communication step. You had little tiny lettering, but rather than talk to the customer about, hey, this lettering is really quite small and it's not going to work. You can't see it from the distance of a handshake. Who's looking at this? What's it supposed to look like? What are you trying to achieve? What part of this wall of text that's under your logo is important to you? How much of it do you want to be visible and from what distance? This kind of stuff, these questions, this communication might take you out of the realm of having to constantly work on extra tiny lettering for no reason. Yes, there are times we do extra tiny lettering. I've done lots of it. Heck, I've done fonts that are made specifically to try and get people out of it that have been sold in products to do that very thing. At the same time, there are times when we're working against our own best interests, and it's all about not communicating with the customer first. So cutting out communication is one of the things that I see lots of digitizers, lots of embroiderers do. And a lot of it seems to be because people are uncomfortable with what feels like a confrontation. And I'm going to give you the most powerful phrase I know one more time if you haven't heard me say it before. When I talk to a customer and I have something that needs to be altered for the nature of the embroidery, I will often talk to them directly about it in those terms and say, hey, if this were my logo and I was putting it on this garment so that people could see this when I came to the door and know that I was professional, I'd probably do this. If this were my logo, these are the changes I would make to achieve this goal. So if it were mine, this is what I would do to get to the goal. And that's something that I think we need to talk about. And I know everybody's like, oh, you're not talking about digitizing right now. I get it. It is digitizing, though, because every time we work in excess detail that doesn't need to be there, every time we work on a design that we could have had another option if we talked to the customer, every time we drop 3 lines of tiny 4mm text under something and they run so poorly that every other run is poor, every other run is a reject because they're just on the edge of what's possible for our configuration or for our garment. That stuff is stuff that really lies in that communication problem. All of that comes from that communication issue. It's not a real digitizing problem because the truth is, when you look at things that are done for the commercial world, when you look at things that are done for the retail world, they make embroidery that runs well and they redesign to get there. I know it's not always an option for everything we have, but if you don't present that to a customer, you really are doing yourself a disservice and you're kind of doing them a disservice too. You can make very detailed pieces. You can work your butt off making the tiniest text and detail possible. Um, is that always going to be useful to you? I don't know. I don't think it's always the way that you really want to go. I think, frankly, a lot of what we're doing would be better if we were suiting the needs of the client, and we have to know those needs and we have to talk to those folks very specifically on the terms of what do they need, what do they want, what are they trying to achieve, and what is the best embroidered result we can get. All right, so I know that's one where you're like, all right, cutting out communication, Eric. We're going to talk about that again. Yeah, we did. But here's the next thing. On that same note, working small. Now, this one you're going to say, all right, you're just going to complain about small text again. I'm like, absolutely not. Actually, this is a digitizing problem. This is something that we frequently find people doing when they get into super fine detail, when they get into working on something maybe photographic and they're not paying attention to everything scale wise. If they don't use fixed scales, things like that, you'll see that as they start to work, they're going to work too small. And what does this mean is not only just working zoomed in too tight on the original artwork, that can be part of the problem. Certainly that can be an issue. And if that's the issue they're having, I'm not saying that is not part of it. It certainly can be. The issue is not just that, though. The issue is also when you are starting to draw and you're drawing in far, far too small a space, and you are not only zoomed in tight, but you're trying to make curves that are too small. You're trying to draw corners that are too small. You're getting sub-stitch length curves, or you're getting lines or satins that are way too narrow, and you're doing so because you're not paying attention to your overall scale. So when I'm talking about working small, that's the one that I see most often. And it's people who get confused, especially new digitizers get very confused when they're working on a piece and they start going really small, really tiny, and they try and get lines that are going to work out. And they see a line that looks like it seems like it should work for them. But then that line doesn't translate to the stitches they expect because they're doing things, especially when they're using curved nodes, continuous curves that pass through the nodes that we draw. And the lines that they have created, now the curves they've created, can't be approximated by the straight lines of stitching. So let me talk about that and show you a little bit more about what I'm talking about. And hopefully we can talk about it a little bit live. I'm going to show you a little bit. We'll see what we can get done on working small. But let's talk about this piece here. You guys know I have all the Viking Age stuff I've done before, and I'll actually show you some of that again in a second. Let me go ahead and blow myself back up so I can go ahead and give you guys the other part of that so you can see some of my designs and work that's there, and I'll scroll through it. Suffice it to say, you guys have seen me do that. I did an episode earlier about my own personal work that I do with kind of Viking Age designs. And some of the stuff that I've done includes some of these brooches. And one of them is this pitney brooch. This is actually an Anglo-Saxon brooch, but it's in the Urness Viking Age style. And it's done in black work. And honestly, it's in black work and in fine details where I see this happening the most, where people have trouble working small. Or when they're doing a heavily detailed piece and there's an area where there's a lot of small lines or detail inside of that single area. Well, here's another small brooch piece I did before. And here's the larger version of it here, as well as a small version that I've taken all my stitches out from. But this one right here, we're talking fairly small. It's about an inch and a half is about where we're at for this one. The other piece I did was even smaller than this. But I'm just using it to kind of show you some details, as well as I'm going to go ahead and show you also the other medallion that I have. If I can get that back up as well, I believe I also have the pitney brooch one. So this is the one that I just showed you in stitches. So we'll pull that one up so you can just kind of see this black work, simple black work on canvas, or on twill actually on this particular piece. I've done it on canvas, but this one's on twill. And so this is a much larger piece. And also we've done this smaller piece, the V-spec piece. And as you can see, pretty small, not super tiny, but I also did a much smaller version of it. And here's the thing, when we get close to this one, and even when you get close to the pitney brooch, you'll say, all right, I see these all look like curves, but we know that any stitch is a line between 2 points. So as we get closer and closer, these curves start not looking like curves anymore. We start having straight lines that are in here. And as we get smaller and smaller and closer, and we see that we're down to, if you can see these grids, and you may not be able to see them, this little square that's in here that I'm kind of tracing with my cursor, that is about 1 millimeter. So we're getting down low, like sub-millimeter lengths on some of these stitches. You're going to notice that we're making curves out of straight lines. The problem is this: when we start working very, very small, so let's say this is the original SVG version of that design that I then output from this other embroidered piece. Let's say that we just take one of these shapes, provided I can get this to, oh, I'm all locked up. Let me unlock everything. Let's just take one of these shapes, take a look at it. And if we can grab one of the shapes that's here, let's ungroup this. And we should be able to kind of work on a piece like that. Let's see what we can get here. This is the shape that I wanted to look at. This is all done with, these are all splines. So let's go ahead and make all these curves so that we have continuous curved lines, right? So if you were looking at that on a Bezier, here's my continuous curved line. If I just go ahead and apply a straight stitch to this line, and you can see that length is 2.5 millimeters. Where is that little shoe-like shape that was there? Well, we're looking at our grids here. That's 1 millimeter. That's 2 millimeters here. This is a sub-millimeter curvature that needs to be broken down into two pieces. And I might have to make some decisions about how small I can really make that curvature in here. Now, obviously, the one answer we have for this is to just use really small stitches. But here's the thing. We're working real small here. That's 1 millimeter stitch length. And on this curvature, because of how those lines are made, 1 millimeter isn't enough. You can have variable stitches depending on your software, but it might just not work for you. So what can you do instead? When you're working small, you have to think about the fact that you are working small, that you're on small stitches. And I'm just going to go ahead and kind of pretend that I'm doing this piece again. And what you'll see is as I'm working, I might say, all right, well, if I've got about 1 millimeter here, I got to approximate this curve. I'm actually going to use straight stitches to go around this and say, yeah, they're sub-millimeter. I don't want to go real small, but I'm just going to go where I can kind of capture that curvature, but maybe not perfectly. And then as I return back, you'll see I might offset those points a little bit so that when this all comes out in the wash, and I think I've kind of cut this a little too sharply here, that I've offset these points just a little bit, and it will look more curved by the fact that I have these different stitches offset, that the penetration points are offset. But then when you start to zoom out and zoom out and zoom out and zoom out, you actually get something that's fairly curved and that is more likely to run. But you're seeing I've got variable stitch lengths and I'm not dropping those stitch points in the same position. When you're working small, it can be easy to forget that, and you'll start drawing all these really intricate curves. Or you look at this piece and go, you know what? At this size, this recurve of this shoe type shape is not going to be visible to anyone. So I'm going to take that recurve out, and I'm only going to make almost like a pointed drop line and just make this a straight angle out of it. Why? Because at this size, when I come back out from there, it's just not noticeable that I have a recurve or a curvature that changes down at the bottom of that boot, that kind of boot-shaped end of the foot on this zoomorphic design. Now you'll see even on this larger piece here, straight lines. I often use just hard nodes, straight lines to draw this stuff. Why? Because I'm going to control my stitch length. By using an actual straight line, I can do that, and I can offset my points. Now, certainly on larger curves, I'm going to use a curve. Why not? There's no problem with that curve. I'm going to go ahead and let it assign that stitch length. It's not a big deal. But when we're working small, we can end up causing problems if we don't kind of think about where that small work is going. Suffice it to say, it's something to think about, that we always are working with straight lines. But the thing to remember is, number one, always using a grid. So when we zoom in, we see the grid, we can see what those stitch lengths are. We know what that is. We calibrate our monitors so that we zoom out to one-to-one sizing. We zoom out to one-to-one sizing, and it's the actual size that it would be in life on our monitor if we stuck the art right to it. And that would be the size of the eventual piece. Between those two things, we end up not working too small. We end up not putting in too many lines. The other thing that can happen too, if we're working on a piece that's this small, I'm probably going to have to think about removing some of the extra detailed lines here. If we zoom in really tight on this shoulder in here, the likelihood of me being able to make this tiny, tiny curve that keeps curving inside of the spiral is really low. So what would I actually do in the final piece? I'm going to reduce it. And even in this piece, you can see I've reduced the curvature and I don't continue to zoom in further and further. Why? Because even at this size that I'm looking at here, you can see how eventually that's just going to kind of buckle in on itself. Excessive detail, excessive density, working small. So if you work too small and you get too slavish to the original art, you end up with difficulty with binding things up, having things cover that you don't want to cover, ending up with details that kind of smash together and are no longer visible. You don't have any open air between those pieces. So as we can see, as the details get smaller, we change things. We make alterations to curvatures. We make alterations to the shapes in order to make them make sense for embroidery, for stitches at the size we actually work on. So a lot of the things we're going to talk about today actually kind of come from the same place. Working small, we zoom in, we forget about what's going on there, and we don't reduce detail as we need to. So working excessively small and drawing small, which is a different thing. So working small, we get in, we zoom in too tight, and we don't think about what's actually happening with the thread that's in that space. And then drawing small, where we drop too many points, we put curves in places where curves aren't going to work, and we don't think of the scale that way. We work so small that then we start to find out that our straight stitches just can't approximate on a lovely Bezier curve. As much as I really love a good minimal input curve where we only have 3 or 4 points on a really nice curve so that we have this sinuous curve that continues through all of our nodes, that when we adjust it, we keep that lovely curvature. We don't have weird corners or anything in our curves. I love those minimal point curves for larger, longer curves. When we are down at the micro scale, we got to control on a more stitch by stitch basis. And so working small, that's something we all fall prey to. And like I said, putting in excess detail into one area is part of that kind of stigma of working small. Because eventually you get to this point where the smaller you get, the less you can fit. See, we've got a couple comments how we're here as well. So a couple more people saying hello as well. Jory said hello, hello. Marianne saying hi from Moss in Santa Fe. Thank you for being here. Lisa Shaw also educating and dealing with her own tech issues today. Good afternoon, Lisa. Happy to have you. And I know you've heard a lot of these complaints. For us, what we often hear, because we're on the software side, is, why is my curve not a curve? And you're like, well, because stitches are never a curve. We're not sticking it down with glue and bending it along the round. It's not quill work. Stitches are straight lines from point to point. We have to approximate all our curves out of those. You make your curve too tight and your stitches too long, and they just can't do the job. So it's worthwhile to check that out. Julie coming in from Oconomowoc, Wisconsin. Hopefully I did that right. I have family in Wisconsin, though I don't know Oconomowoc myself. But here we go. And she said, we have a bimbo in Oconomowoc too. For guys you folks who don't know, what that is I've got a bread company, Bimbo Bread Company, above my head right here. Yeah, that's one of the largest bread baking companies in the world, Factory Bread. So yeah, we're not making bimbo jokes or something around here. We don't do that on this channel. What we do have, however, is bread product logos. So if you were wondering what that was in the comments, we're not banning Julie. She's absolutely correct. We also have a bimbo factory around here too. All right, so beyond that, got other folks saying hi. So I'm going to say hi to a few folks there. B saying hi from South Australia, stormy South Australia. We had some good storms out here in Albuquerque, New Mexico last night. Got a lot of flash flood washes. I'll tell you this, guys. Everybody who says, oh, you're out in the desert, it must be so dry. I'm like, yeah, except for the few minutes of the monsoon season when everyone gets washed out of the valley. Slightly different stuff, folks. Ron saying good day from Milk River. And DJ Kev saying, I appreciate this education. Awesome. Thank you, sir. Thank you for being here. And Jerry said I have to watch on Facebook so I can get closed captions. Yeah, go ahead. Watch wherever you need to. It's all good. Scott's in from Sunrise Tactical. Thank you for being here. Happy Friday. And Chuck's in from Central Florida. Happy to have you in too. So yeah, so like I said, what do we cover so far? Cutting out communication, not talking to people what we need. Working small is rough. One of them that's really easy to jump on because I just talked about working small is just excess density. This one is hard. And why do we keep on going too far into excess density? And I'm somebody who will sometimes end up in this pickle too, right? This is often because customers, especially customers in the commercial world, are not comfortable with any amount of color show through to the point where they don't view things at a distance. And if they see any sort of haze of the color of the garment below, say, a large filled area, they can get pretty grumpy with us. And especially if we're digitizers who are working off site, somebody who's digitizing for someone else to run, A lot of us feel like we have to get to that target density because we're worried about having somebody come back to us with um, a design that has to be edited and worked over. So excess density is one of the things that people have to fight. But I'm also talking about working small to a degree, because excess density also means too many small details in an area. If we get too small in any particular design and we start to shrink down, we get below the sizing that is normal, you're going to find that those details just can't hold up. As we know, density is just a function of how close together lines of thread are. So whether those lines are in a fill or in our shading or in our outlining, as we get a design smaller and smaller, if we include all of the lines that are in our original art, we can end up with things having excess detail density also. The thing that's also not great about excess density is three-dimensional density. You guys know I've talked about three-dimensional density, two-dimensional density being how close together lines of stitching are, three-dimensional density being how many times we throw penetration points and leave little wedges of thread through our design and through our garment. We have to remember, every time you put in a stitch, we drop a piece of thread and we leave it back there and we pull another piece of thread right back up. We put two little thread wedges in between the fibers of our original garment every time we drop the needle. If we do that a lot in one area, whether through details or the edges of multiple satins lining up, we can end up kind of bunching that together. And the only place for the garment to go is up or down as it pushes away, as it tries to get those threads out of the way of the decoration. So excess density, excess detail in one area can give us cupping and dishing. So the design will cup, it'll sink in, it'll dish, it'll pop up, or we'll just see distortion or hard points of thread in that area. So excess density is just putting too much in too little of a space. So the funny thing is, excess density really is working small. It's the same thing. It's working too small. It's putting in too many lines. It's putting in too much detail in an area. And we're talking about fills. This is something I've shown you guys a million times, but it's something that I still think is worth showing you. Excess density is easily remedied to a degree by doing swatch tests when you're doing fills, when you're working with a new thread especially. This is one that I did with some spun polyester thread. Frankly, the original that I did for this was serger thread. I wanted to see more about sewing thread. I've got more of my compatriots who are in the, like Joe Kramer, who are in the fully retail side of embroidery. He worked for Abercrombie and Fitch as well as many others in that realm. So in that kind of area. And he used sewing thread for a lot of that work we saw that was a little bit fuzzy, but still had a little bit of shine. Sewing thread, so polyester thread or spun polyester, you can get embroidery specific, but they used a lot of sewing thread as well. It can be done, though you have to be careful because it is thicker and fuzzier than normal thread. But in this test specifically, this is that similar kind of sewing thread, that spun poly. You can see that I made these little boxes with the same settings for the underlay. It is a single tatami style or fill style perpendicular underlay, but every box I incremented up that density a little bit at a time. Down here on the bottom right is about 4 points or 0.4 millimeters. And as you can see, though that's considered for 40 weight thread at least to be the top, if we back up, we can keep going back and back and back, and we'll find that there's a place somewhere here on this second line where we've got decent coverage that we'd probably be okay with, and we wouldn't have to go to this extreme over here in the bottom right. Now, that's interesting, and you'll say, all right, for that fuzzy thread, maybe that works, Eric, but what about other threads? And this is one that I had done much earlier, and this is just regular, absolute garden variety, run-of-the-mill polyester. This is black polyester embroidery thread, 40 weight, the stuff you would expect. And I know you guys have seen this, you've been with me for a while, but I always like to make people kind of aware of this over and over again. This is the same kind of thing. We're down here in the bottom right-hand corner is absolute full density as you would expect. So we've got that 0.4 millimeter or 4-point density here. And back here at the top left is about half of that. I went incrementally along, increasing that density on each square so I could see, hey, when do I get to a place where the coverage looks pretty good? And I'd say you can back down 2 squares, and I'm pretty happy with this coverage. And you can also see that with more and more density, we actually get a little bit more rippling and curving. You can kind of see how the garment starts to react to full density. As we get full density and more penetration, we end up with a little bit more curvature and puckering. I backed down 2 squares, and I feel pretty happy with that. And that's actually 18% less stitch count, 18% less density, which means you're getting back that 18% of your time at the machine as well. This is something that is worthwhile to do every once in a while, is to say, all right, in these kind of color combinations with this kind of thread, what density do I really need? Not the one someone told me, not the one that said it's default. And by the way, defaults in software, that's another one too. Getting too comfortable with defaults in software when we know that different garments require different things, and you may have a font or an asset or something that runs differently depending on the base levels of what things are, how wide the garment or the satin stitches are, what garment we're running. Don't get too comfortable with defaults. But yeah, not default settings in the case of this density. Knowing what the settings are and applying them yourself. That's the thing. You could be running with severely lighter hands and have a garment that flows better and feels better by reducing your densities, but you have to test. Now, the thing is, if this were white thread on a black garment, if this is black on a pure white garment, it might not be quite the same. So I'm not going to say that these settings are just set it and forget it. You test it once and it's always the same. And if you start to change your thread around, if you start to change the garment around, you work on something fuzzy, these things can change. But I'm just saying these kinds of tests, especially if you're working on a certain kind of garment a lot, let's say your whole business is doing golf shirts for the pro club, well, then I would get really good at knowing what densities make sense, what underlays make sense for that particular garment. This actually comes into something else I'm going to talk about as one of the mistakes we make. But yeah, that's a big one. Excess density can be tested out. And because we know the measurement of densities, because we understand this stuff, I mean, swatch testing is really important in general, but because we can understand that stuff, because it's something that is a known measurement, it is also something that we can fairly easily understand as part of anything we're doing with drawing, with detail, with shading. Those things are very easily understood as well. And I think once we start sampling and understanding measurements, it's worthwhile to understand that. In fact, I did an episode earlier where I talked about drills. So embroidery drills, drill designs where we do things like put lines further and further spaced apart and see how close they are together before they start to cover each other. Things like that. Those kind of drills and tests can really help you get a hold of your settings if it's something you don't feel comfortable with. So it's something worth looking at. The settings and working on densities is really interesting too. We got a couple different concepts here too. We have people saying hello, so I'm going to say hi to Chuck in. Ron says, bulletproof designs on the garment. We've all been there. Hey, you've got a customer who says, I absolutely want to have, ultimate coverage on a piece. And sometimes that's what you do. You put it together and you do the best, because the thing is, if that is more important to them than the feeling of the garment, that can be an answer a customer gives us. It's not a great answer, but it's a answer a customer can give us. So let's see. We got a question for DJ Kev on that one. I would like to know the best way to get coverage using white thread on a black shirt. I get show through a lot of times. I don't want to add too much density. There's a couple different things. Let me see if I can actually bring one up for you, because I have one thing that I like very much is a mesh underlay. So a mesh underlay or a double tatami underlay, depends on your software. And I'm going to go see if I can bring that up as a graphic. I might have to stop and grab that one. But let's see if I can get that one for you. Suffice it to say, the mesh underlay is huge, and that's where we have two fill style underlays at 45 degrees and 135 degrees off of the main fill angle. So let me see if I can actually grab you the better version of this so I can show you both. Yeah, here's the result and the actual underlay. So let me grab the results and the underlay and show it to you. So like I said, we're a little off kilter today because of all the technical issues, but we're going to get there. This is the difference between using a standard single fill underlay over here on the top. So this is just done. This is approaching full density. So we're getting up close to that. We're like probably a 0.42 or 4.2 points, somewhere in there. 0.4 is the highest I tend to go on a fill like this. And we're seeing a fair amount of show through in this piece. And we're seeing a lot less here. It's not perfect, but we're seeing a lot less show through on this bottom piece. And let me show you the difference between those two things. And we'll go ahead and back out of this and I'll show you what we're actually looking at. The bottom piece has an underlay that looks like this. It's a grid. It's a grid at 45 and 135. So we end up with this kind of mesh. It looks kind of like a chain link fence. Any stitch lands on about 2 or more of those. You can change your spacing on this anywhere in the realm of, I would say, like 3 mil spacing on this. So it's extremely low density grid. You might have one that's called double tatami. So 30 point if you're in using something like that, if you're using points instead, a 30 point density on this, it's really low density, but you have essentially a fill that goes at 45 degrees, another fill that returns at 135 degrees. So it just makes that kind of mesh underneath it. And I don't think I have any other illustrations of that real quick, but rather than go into searching for that illustration, just to show you that the difference between using a single tatami underlay, like I showed you in the earlier swatch test, which is what we see up at the top here, and that down here, it's massive. So that can help. The other thing I'm going to tell you, though, is that there are times where if I've got a customer who is absolutely dead set on it and they have a big slabby area behind it. So let's say they've got a logo that has a big satin fill around it, but it's got a big slab of white on black and they're running something on a lighter garment and I don't want that intense amount of fill on it. I have also done a very light fill over an applique. Now, this is not in white on black, but I'm going to see if I can show you what I'm talking about because I actually had something very similar that I've shown before on the show. But let's go ahead and pull this up. In this case, this is a very similar thing that I did. This is actually a full back design, but it was done on sports shirts, and they over and over just kept saying, I want to do this full back design on these polo shirts. And I fought with them about it because I didn't think it was a great idea. It was a heavy design. It's got a big circle on that sucker that's 3-4 inches of width on this circle, and they were like, nope. And then we want it to be fully embroidered. We want to have that high quality look of full embroidery. And I fought and fought and fought. This customer knew what they want. They were going to get it. But what I eventually did, and I actually showed them the sample before I said anything else to them, you can kind of see, boy, those fill stitches look awful loose. Why do those fill stitches look loose? Because we're at less than half density on that fill, and that has an applique underneath it. And I have done the same thing on customers who have, if you have a simple shape where I'm not trying to place a crazy applique, because this is the original they had done. And by the way, you can see that's how distorted and horrible that thing looked because they were running super full fills with no stabilization underneath that piece. And it's just ridiculous. So I was like, all right, that is just crazy. I'm not into that. I didn't want to, I had to fix this thing. But then when we did it, they're like, okay, not only are we doing it on white, we're doing it on a sports shirt, and I want that big full fill to be represented. And I said, all right, well, we're going to do that as an applique with a light fill on top of it instead. But that's the thing. Really, that's something that I don't love having to do. It's not my favorite thing to do every time. So most of the time, I'm just going to run that nice underlay, that grid underlay that's going to help me out. Really good underlay, long stitch lengths. That's the way to handle it on a fill. If you're on a satin, then using like a German style underlay, so edge run plus double zigzag can be very good for it. And honestly, just using those zigzags, keeping your tension right, and also topping to some degree. If your garment is fuzzy whatsoever, sometimes the coverage can look better with a water-soluble topper. It can just hold up the design a little bit. Now, for me, if I was running on something with any texture, we use water-soluble topping on most everything. But yeah, and I'll agree. Cindy says this, and I agree on this one too. What happens to production time? What I have to think about on my side doing long production runs? Yeah, that's the thing. Lower top density, increased underlay means more coverage without putting all the penetration points in the same angle, so I don't get the distortion, but I get that full coverage, and it's still less stitches overall than if I kept tightening and tightening and tightening the coverage down. So for me, I wouldn't do that. Now, when we're talking about adding applique under something, that is for people who are going to pay for it. I'm not people who don't pay. I tell them the options. When we're talking about the folks from Duke City over there, and I'll pull that one back up just to show it to you one more time. These folks were ready to pay for a full jacket bag that had the full coverage under it. If you think that I reduced their costs on the stitch count because I added the applique underneath it, no. I know how much time it takes to do both things. And the reduced stitch count, the ease of putting this on, and the final garment, we had our nut covered for that, right? That's what we always say. We covered the nut that we put into it. We covered the pot, right? We knew what the cost was going in. And this, for us, was less cost and by far a much better garment that's going to wear better and make the customer happier than if we didn't put the applique in. It's not something I would do all the time. Also, some people like to use those tearaway covering sheets. I really never have. Most of the time, I want everything that I do, unless I'm using real applique, material that's underneath something, most of the time, I am not going to use a material that I don't know is going to be permanent. I'm not going to use a material that is something that I don't trust. And I honestly, those little cover sheets and that are in different colors, I've never wanted to buy and stock a bunch of colors of covering sheets to do that stuff. Most of the time, underlay is enough. Underlay is usually enough. Rarely we have to do something else. When we have to do something else, that's, I'm not really looking to add an additional substrate if I don't have to. I am kind of with Cindy. When I have a garment that really makes sense for it, I also have had left chest designs where it really helped on a basket weave polo, and they had a badge style design that was going to have a large area that had lots of details on top of it. I find that the applique is going to be about like stitch count. It's very similar. And actually, I just think I saw Joe say exactly the same thing. I'm going to bring up a comment in a moment from somebody who knows better. For me, the stitch count of a fully filled area versus an applique, if you have it down, if you have the cutting under control, and it's not a big thing for you to do, for real, it can be a better cost, or at least a cost-effective way to go. And frankly, way less time on the machine, even with the placement, I find, especially as we get to larger sizes, because the placement and tack down steps, especially if we don't do full coverage or don't do even half coverage on them, the placement and tack down take nowhere near. When I've done exposed applique, when people are okay with the look of the applique itself, unlike the folks from Duke City, when they're okay with the look of the applique, it's nowhere near. It's no contest on large areas to be putting an applique instead. But still, even with full stitch count, I find that the time is often about the same. And so just to say hi to who I'm seeing in the comments, you guys know I'm getting chased around here. I forget what I'm doing. Sometimes I see a good comment. This is Joe Kramer, who I talked about doing that retail style work. Not retail style. He was doing work for large retail brands. Let me not diminish that, my friend. He says, hello and happy Friday. But Joe says, the cost of applique versus stitch count is usually a wash, but it will look amazing next to the fill stitches, especially when the fabric varies. Yeah, see, that's how I feel about it. It really is much better for me. And he also says, I love your sample wall. It's an old photo for my green screen, but I do sometimes love being back in this space in my head for a minute. This is my old shop, right? I'm not in my old shop, but sometimes it's nice to look at the old samples that were there and to kind of think about that. But yeah, and people will also say, have you done applique for anything but large backs? And I'll say, yeah. In fact, I have one that I'm going to show you really quickly, because I have a piece that I did applique that looks kind of patch style, but it is an applique done on left chest. And let me show it to you. And there's a couple of reasons why that might be useful. And then I'll get on with the rest of our topic here. But this is something that actually goes to working too dense and working too small. This is a piece I did for these folks here, the custodial department. And yes, this is for one of the labs. And they've got their different pieces there for say, so it's Clean Tech, San Ildefonso, let's say here. What we can see here is this was going on. It was a piqué polo, so nothing that's going to be that crazy. But you can imagine if I'm trying to do a white fill on piqué polo, we've got this full circular piece. They have very small text. You can see the size of the buttons there. That text is small. That's not maybe excessively tiny, but that's some small text, right? That is not the biggest text you've ever seen. It's certainly not normal left chest text. And you can see that kind of native style pattern that's going around this outer edge. That is done with straight stitches and very small satins and is a fairly tight, clean pattern. That is a lot easier to maintain on top of twill than it is on top of texture. So these are all good reasons to do it. And I'm going to tell you, compared to filling that entire thing, not only was it, I think, a wash as far as the time on the machine, especially with a circle, when it's something that I don't have to worry about the orientation, as long as the circle is covering the right stitches. I'm not trying to, this is not a complex piece of a piece of design work to put this in there, and the placement's pretty simple. It just has to be on there. It's a perfect circle. Then it's not a big deal, and it's fully something that I would do. And in this case, it also meant that the garment itself was really light. If you wanted to, you could even pre-embroider all of these and cut out those circles with the embroidery already on them and only sew the outer edge. In this case, I went right through it. So yeah, and that's, and Cindy says, and I'll go ahead and answer this question since we're answering questions while we're here too. So looking at the custodial, when would you make a patch as opposed to tackle twill? In this case, I wanted to do a full tackle twill and just do this as direct embroidery, because they want a direct embroidery. They're not looking for the look of that edge of the patch. There are some people for whom the patch looks cheap. Now, not everybody's like that. And these days, we're talking about now, lots of people are much more into patches and see patches as a desirable thing. Since the era of the patch hat kind of came around, the edge of the patch lifting from the garment was not seen as a bad thing. However, with this customer, with lots of customers I've dealt with, folks specifically feel like the edge of the patch lifting off or adding a patch made it look like it was cheaper, like it wasn't as nice or as high quality as direct embroidery. So for these folks, I would do tackle twill, even though it does look very patch-like. The very smooth edge and the fact that that edge doesn't lift, and I'll go ahead and make myself small here so you can see it one more time. The fact that the edge is not lifting and that we have direct embroidery means that we're really well integrated into the garment. And I absolutely understand. You're saying also it's more work having to then sew or heat on the patch. Yeah, that's another thing too, is that you have another step involved. In this case, it really is just embroidery with one extra small step of a placement line and me sticking these on. And remember, with a lot of these pieces that I did, those are done with a pressure sensitive poly twill because the shine didn't bother those customers. It means I stuck them on like stickers. Now you can still do it with spray adhesive as well. You stick them down like you're sticking a sticker on something. As long as you can stick a sticker inside of lines, it goes really pretty quickly, right? So it is something that is not that difficult to do. And especially with shapes that are not going to be oriented in one side specifically. So yeah, it depends. But let's go ahead and go on from there. We have a few more things I want to cover before I get done today. And I was hoping to be kind of short. I don't know if we're going to be real short today, but I'm going to try to use less examples, just kind of say the last few things that we have here. But if you guys have more questions or comments, I would love to kind of talk about it too. Couple more things. We have a couple of comments that are really good here, so I'm going to go ahead and grab it. Joe says, about the patch / applique, in addition, the stitches will clean up nicely on that tight woven poly twill, the heavy texture knit. The detail will just not the same credit for the same file. Absolutely not. No. If we're looking back at that piece, and let me see if I still have that up real quick before we finish up. Yeah, this really fine detail, I'm telling you, these are real fine lines here, folks. And I'm zooming in about as tight as you can get. Heck, you can see my tie-off stitches because this is so tight. And you can see things that might look like flaws if you didn't zoom back out of them. Yeah, you're not going to see that extremely nice, clean line there that we have if it's on directly on the piece. And especially even on fill, you're not going to see as clean a line as you do on twill. So there is something to that. Now, there wasn't a ton of fine detail on it, but it does look very nice. And so I personally do like a nice piece of twill on that piece. When they're heat pressed down, they're incredibly strong. And honestly, a piece like that that's sewn down on so many edges, if you didn't heat press it, it'd be fine. You don't have to have that extra step. Some people do, some people don't. When you're doing a really big piece that doesn't have a lot of stitching over it, yeah, maybe now you need to heat fuse it. Otherwise, you might not need to. You sew that down and it's good to go. But yeah, really depends on how you feel about that. But like Joe says, I find that the stitch count versus covering up and some of the benefits we get out of that twill are so good that I don't like to give away from those. And yeah, Sydney says, come from the old world tackle twill, love the heat twill. Yeah, heat press twill is fantastic. Tacking irons, I've done the whole bit. That's not something that's alien to me. Most of mine was done for sports. So the classic tackle twill name, stuff like that. But yeah, twill patches, stuff like that. And indeed, doing it in logo work, I think is all valid and ways to not get too high on your density or to work into textures that don't function very well for the design, just like Joe said. So last few things, and we'll go ahead and make these kind of rapid fire because I think we're going to try and keep this a short day with everybody kind of struggling through their day with tech problems, travel problems, and everything under the sun as far as that goes. Let's talk about the last few things. Believing the screen, no matter how many times, and I think older digitizers, we don't do this anymore. We have a tendency not to have this problem. But digitizers keep on continually having this issue of looking at the screen and trusting it and not realizing that it's just nothing matters about how the preview looks until we get to the embroidery. Yes, there are things we can see. Color should be in the right place. Logos need to be in the right shape. Distortion, though, is going to be there. You're going to see issues with distortion. You're going to see that. And what's on screen is never going to be what you see on the machine. And no matter what we do, even me sometimes, even though older digitizers don't tend to do it in the most egregious way where we literally look at a design and feel like something's off, there will be times where we work so precise on screen trying to get right to where we want to be that we end up with really doing ourselves a disservice because then we run it and realize I should have just been looser. I should have done the work I needed to do. You have to trust that process. I know everybody says trust the process, and I think it's such a goofy kind of phrase sometimes. But the concept of, trusting the process, it really does make a big difference to understand that the produce of a digitizer is the embroidery, not the file, and to get that into your feeling about the screen. The screen is there as a independent step to help you get where you need to go. It is not the final step. It is not where it's going to be in the end. It is not where we expect things to go. It is absolutely just an intermediate step to let us preview the design before we get to the embroidery machine. And something I'm going to say again in some of these other options in just a moment here too. And like I said, I've had a little bit of trouble today as I got online, so I lost a couple of my examples that I wanted to show you guys. I might be typing in the background. But believing the screen, not thinking about that final stage of compensation is a massive issue that people return to over and over again. New digitizers, obviously worse. And funny enough, some of the people who I think find it the most frustrating are actually designers who come from print, people who come from other disciplines where there is not such a disconnect between the screen and what they're doing, in the actual equipment, on the tooling, whatever equipment it is they finally run their pieces out on. They don't have that same sort of issue with distortion. And if you're somebody who doesn't have that in your head, if it's not something that is common to your work, if it's not something that you expect, it can be really frustrating and hard to work through, especially when you find that people may or may not know that who are providing digitizing online. If you're getting your digitizing from someone else and it has been auto-digitized, I'm going to talk about that again in a moment, if it has been done in a way that's not as careful with compensation, or if you move to a radically different garment and you're not someone who thinks about how the material affects the embroidery, that difference between the screen and the machine can be very jarring. If no one stops to tell you that, if you've never seen it for yourself, especially the very kind of young in the business, digitizers get incredibly frustrated on their first run. I mean, I know I did too. I kind of had to figure that out. Luckily, I had been an operator, so I didn't come to it with quite the lack of experience, that below the lower jaw, really in the bones experience of having worked on something physically and seen it happen. And this is the example I often show folks, just basic lettering. Look at the top and bottom of consulting here. This is the exact same file. Nothing has been altered. If I looked at that lettering on screen down there at the bottom, we can see how nasty and how we have the camel hump case. We have these short lines. We have long lines. We have all of those issues happening. And it very much does not look even. But when we look at this piece, aside from the optical arrangement where we have slightly taller letters for curved letters, because that is just something that happens even in an open type font, even in vector, to make our eye see things at the right height. Very even tops and bottoms on this piece. Very, very even. Also, even though you can only see the tail of it on this particular design, you see how this outline, we got yellow that's coming outside of this outline here. There is not a speck of that yellow fill coming outside of the outline. You can tell this hasn't been post cleaned. I've got some loops that aren't perfect in it. I've got some outlines that aren't exact. But when you see this from any distance, there is not a speck of that yellow fill outside of the outline, but on screen, there's going to be a ton of it. And also, even in these strokes that are coming out of this kind of reticle here, we can see that these satin strokes are much thicker on screen than they are on the machine. This is just something that people have to get through. And frankly, even those of us who do this for a long time, especially if you become a digitizer who isn't doing as much production, there can come a time where you start to forget that feeling in your bones that you need to throw wide. You need to have wider satins than you expect. You need to have overlap. You need to have extensive warping, especially on heavier, thicker garments, things that are going to pull and distort quite a lot. So believing the screen can be a big problem for that. And that's something that is useful, right? It just really depends. So yeah, it is kind of something that can be upsetting to people. They can get very frustrated. And I talked about this too. We talked about these expectations people get. And we talked a little about auto-digitizing. That's one of the other things too. I always call it going on autopilot. If people come in with auto-digitizing, or when someone sells them the concept of auto-digitizing, you can end up with, something that really does us a disservice. Again, we end up with something that you cannot use, but you start out with something that seems like a useful, a useful piece, something that is worthwhile, something that you might want to use because you use a very simple logo, or you are fed something. Somebody says, here's auto-digitizing working in this software, and here's our best shot at it, right? And they will show you a design that does work with auto-digitizing until you feed anything more detailed, anything painterly, anything photographic, anything even with a confusing shape that causes the internal kind of algorithms that decide what stitches go where to break down. It doesn't hold up. And so it is kind of difficult, right? It is very difficult that people continually sell auto-digitizing. I'm not saying there's no place in the world for automatic digitizing of any kind. That's not necessarily what I'm trying to say. What I am trying to say, however, is that there is a very big difference between what that is as far as the reality of what it can provide for us versus what we can get out of real, honest to goodness digitizing done by a human who cares. It's just not the same thing, let alone the artistic sensibilities that we're talking about in this world, right? In this world of embroidery digitizing, even when we're talking about something that is very simple, there are times where auto digitizing can just fall over dead. And in ways that you really wouldn't expect, on designs that you wouldn't think are difficult, on pieces that don't seem to have any sort of problem with them that you would consider to be difficult, auto digitizing can really fall apart. And that's just kind of the unhappiness about this, is that it's something where it seems simple. People sell it as simple. They continually tell us that it's going to work out, but it's not always. And I'm going to show you something without naming names. So I'm not going to name names on where this comes from, but this very week, somebody sent me a show from a fairly well-respected decoration house. Let's just let it be there. And they were talking about this solution, and the guy was selling the solution saying, we're doing auto digitizing, we're doing auto for everything, and auto digitizing is going to fix everything. And here it goes. And I went to their site to see what it was, because I'm like, all right, hey, maybe somebody has finally gotten the AI robot that has drained my brain and will do this work. And maybe simple designs are all going to work out for everybody now. And without naming names, because you can find out for yourself. They put a set of designs out as their best designs, or I assume because it is the set of designs that says, hey, send us this work so that we can do this for you and you won't have to do it yourself. And when I opened up a few of them, I was not only kind of unhappy with them, I saw something absolutely unacceptable. Because the guy who was selling it saying, yes, this is absolutely, we use it for all of our corporate merch and we don't touch any of the designs. If you are an embroiderer like I am, I think you're already seeing the problem here, right? So we're looking at this text that says corporate merch. This is one of the example designs that was offered as, hey, you don't have to do digitizing anymore. And though I can start by just saying some of the stitch angles are a little weird, I don't love that stuff here and here. Okay, maybe it's weird that each of these dots has a different angle. We've got very small stitches and weird kind of density gaps. And I don't even really quite understand what's going on with this shape here. And it's got some weird jumps in it and design elements that are much, much too small. If I look in here, we've got a lot of sub-millimeter stitches going on and weird stitch angles, sure. But then I looked at the most basic thing, the thing that we do the most in embroidery, and that's text. And if we want to compare the R up here in corporate, either of these R's, with the R in merch, and you tell me what's wrong with that. We suddenly have decided that we're no longer breaking that stroke up. The auto digitizing did not catch it. The top of the M has these weird little short stitches in it. The R that's here also has these long, long stitches in them. And by the way, I will measure them live for you to let you know. We're talking about like 8mm stitches that make up the backbone of this R and are completely vertical. And even if that was something that was technically okay, which it really kind of isn't, it's not going to look very good. It's going to expand on the wrong directions. It doesn't match either of the other two R's at all. I'm not saying every piece of auto digitizing is this poor. I'm not saying everything that their software does is this poor. What I'm saying is it's going to make those choices for you, and what you get is what you get. And unless you want to go in and do the editing yourself, it may or may not be of any use to you. So that's one of those things where I'm like, hey, I understand that it sounds great, right? I understand that it seems like something that would really help us do this work, but it just is not there. It's not all the way there yet. It can't make decisions about the sequencing. It can't make decisions about technically what the embroidery needs in a way that's intelligent. It can't make different decisions based on garments yet, at least the ones that I'm looking at as far as like those automated solutions where you don't ever touch anything. And even the best of the best of the best will have panics like that that require you to go in and rework it. For my money, for my time, I either want to work with a digitizer who does their work, or I want to do the work myself so that I'm not doing that. Especially when we're talking about the third R in a string of letters. I could copy and paste that R. I'm not doing that work 3 times anyway. A few letters, that's also a problem that digitizers sometimes have, especially young digitizers or ones who get in the habit of using fonts for everything. When they're working on logos for exact matches, they go searching for fonts forever when they should have just digitized the few characters they needed. That's something true. Also, copy and paste from yourself. Steal from the best. Steal from you. And like I said, some of the other logos they did are okay. They're not great, but they're okay. And I'll go ahead and show you a couple of the other ones that were from that thing. So I'm not just entirely, dunking on them. These are okay, but then look, sometimes we're starting at a flat at the top and then we're ending at a point that comes down to a tapered point on this logo on the side of this 5-tran. Sometimes we're turning, sometimes we're not. We're turning around the bottom of the V instead of overlapping the strokes, which may or may not be what you want to do. And honestly, I would never do that on a letter of this size. Is it horrid? No. Would this run? Probably yes. Would you see some weird narrowing? And especially the fact that we are flat cut on this one satin stitch end out of like 3 that are right next to each other. It's just not consistent and it's not the best look. It doesn't mean that there aren't things that won't be okay. And look at this is another one from that same sample kit. We've had an absolute panic on stitch angles around that D. So like I said, not all solutions are like that. There are better softwares that do a better job of it. What I'm saying is, for my money, if it was doing this to this logo, what would it do to a lace piece? What would it do to even one of my little designs that has a few different colors and has these stitch angles in it? I put a bunch of my Viking stuff up here because I want to slag on everybody's designs all the time, but I'd take mine own on. What would it do even with this single color piece where I've done some carving for the background of this Valkyrie silver? Would it do any of that? No, because it would see the silver as the background and make it one big fill. It just isn't the same as digitizing for yourself. And it doesn't mean that it might not have a place in the world, but just going on auto is just not going to work out for me. So we got a couple more people talking about it and just say, hey, Cindy says, in the home embroidery world, I watched some shows that scan a fabric shape and auto-digitize it. Yeah, for shapes, for applique, we have a trace mode in Embroiance that works for that. And it works fine. Tracing basic shapes in art is fine. Throwing a graphic at it, throwing a photograph at it, throwing anything that's detailed, that's you can see what you might get. And admittedly, yeah, shaking my head, absolutely. Cindy says, can you imagine the machine sound we get to that R? Yeah, we might be in ka-chunk territory. Not quite. That's only about 7-8 mils. It'll probably run good. It'll slow for sure, but it'll probably run. And that's the thing. DJ Kev says, term auto has made away in a lot of industries. I'm an old school DJ that came from real records, mixing and scratching. Now they make auto buttons for this stuff. It's not the same. Absolutely. Cindy says, you wonder about the tie-offs? Do the tails just pull the design right off? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm looking at that piece, and it's got some ties. It's got some stuff in it, some of those pieces. But like I said, they just aren't what a digitizer could do. And when I'm looking in that, by the time I upload a design and send it to someone and get it back, some of those designs were a few letters and a couple of strokes. A not very skilled digitizer with a minimal understanding of how things worked could pull those off real quickly. And some of those, I always say don't match fonts on logos. But if your logo font is literally like Helvetica, is Swiss, is something where you might really honestly have that, you might be worthwhile to just go ahead and use one. You could use one if it's a dead-on exact match. I know I say don't match. If it's a dead-on exact match, like our block is very similar. It's like Myriad. If you had Myriad in your logo and then you go and you're using Stitch Artist and you've got our block, Myriad Bold is real close to the point where you might be able to just use it and it wouldn't look like a knockoff. It's when somebody uses Arial instead of Helvetica and the R has the wrong leg and it looks goofy that I say quit trying to match stuff. Or when people just get close, they're like, okay, I got a slab serif and it's close. And then that doesn't look good. It looks like a knockoff garment instead of a real thing. And yeah, I'm with you, Ron. The D in FanDuel is horrid. But that's the thing. A person didn't make that. So I don't think I'm cussing a person. I'm just saying, hey, that needs a lot of tuning. I certainly, and I'll say this, if I were a customer, I would not accept this happening to my logo. If I saw that happening, either that or like I showed you before, that R, I would not accept that. The R on merch. If I saw a piece and my piece had that vertical satin and then this weird thing going on down here, I would not accept that in my own garment. Now, I don't know. Maybe their customers are very forgiving. Mine weren't. Mine wouldn't have accepted that, but now we were a little bit higher end. I charged more and we did more. That's how it is. So that's that. Let's go to the next kind of thing that digitizers kind of continually do. And this one can be very hard, especially for people who come from the design world who are used to doing print or digital. Forgetting the physicality, right? Not only is it, desirable to like do that kind of going on autopilot. And in fact, I'm going to go ahead and preempt this by going into the second problem we have. We talked about autopilot working with auto-digitizing and thinking it's going to fix everything. Conversion thinking. That's the other thing I'm going to talk about. Meaning that people will bring in vectors and try and just assign stitch types to vector shapes without realizing that we often need to redraw those shapes. Now, that's something that doesn't keep happening to digitizers as much, though I'm going to tell you from my own experience, the more you're working with vector art, your brain will try and push you back in there where you're like, all right, I drew a lot of vector already for this print piece. How much of this can I pull over and just edit? And you can find yourself falling back into conversion thinking where you're like, man, I'll just pull that SVG over and I'll just work on it. And in fact, I'll go back to that design we talked about much earlier, that little bitty medallion I did, the V-Spec medallion. And we'll go ahead and pull that up to talk about this conversion thing. And we'll get to the physicality one more time at the end. I think that's how we're finishing this off today. But absolutely, this concept of being able to just convert something from one to the other, convert even from vector. The thing is, even if we're not talking about auto-digitizing, the other thing is the thing that I did when I first showed you this piece, right? If I were going in here, and this is actually an SVG that was drawn, that was traced on top of the original design. So let's say we get rid of that. And this is the original vector lines that were drawn on the design for print, right? So we'll find some things like that is the background, and then the detail lines are drawn in on top. Well, you can imagine that, let's say I wanted this in satin stitches, the chances are how I'm going to want to do that is to have different satin stitches. I'm probably going to want to have one satin stitch here. And like I said, this will be sloppy as the the delay between me clicking and getting a point on here is wild sometimes when I'm streaming. I end up with much weirder options than you might think what it's looking like. You might do one satin stitch and then want to come back and do a couple more satin stitches to overlap it. And so let's say I wanted to do that and I'm not worrying about any sort of sequencing or anything else. Well, I'm now drawing these shapes that are vastly different from the shapes that I have in the art. And then let's say not only that, but then I'm like, oh, I'm going to go under this piece later. Well, then I want to make that end to come all the way under so that I'm going to cover some of those stitches, right? Because I'm starting to think about the embroidery. I'm starting to think about how the actual piece is going to look. And then I'm like, all right, well, actually, I'm looking at this piece and maybe the sequence is a little different. Actually, I want this to be sequenced on top of the other so I can start making this design. I'm going to go down this one first, and I'm going to come back and do this piece. And then I'm going to go back over with this piece so that I get these interesting kind of outlines or I get these shapes. And, we can probably get a better color than this to show that, which is probably, I'm being very foolhardy doing this while I'm streaming since it does slow everything down crazy. But let's say we get a gold here. We might be able to see those shadows just a little bit better when we zoom out. We get that cool shadow line when we do that carving space. The thing is, these shapes that I just made, these don't exist in this piece. And when you get into that conversion thinking, you're like, oh, well, I've got this shape already. How do I make this shape into satin stitches? And you're like, oh, well, maybe I can cut between here and here. And then if I do that, I can break across, which you can do. And if you have your nice software like we have in Stitch Artist, you can do that. And then you're like, okay, I can redo that and I can organize this piece, but then this one's busted. Well, okay, well, now I'm going to move this. I'm going to do that. And you're like, well, except I really wanted to have 3 outline pieces that go around this shape, right? I want this piece too. And I'm like, all right, but then I have this inset. Now am I trying to combine this piece? Oh, wait, that's only a line. I can't cut that line out of this shape. And you end up where you start doing this work that doesn't need to be done, where you saw how quick it was for me to draw those satin stitches. And I actually used Bezier curves. I didn't use a double ladder entry where you just do, and I'm not even trying at all, where you do something like that, where it immediately sets your satin angles and everything else. That's even faster than what I just did. I've been so used to working on fonts where I work really primarily in Bezier that I went straight for the Bezier tool. But it's so fast if you get a handle on understanding your control points. If you start to understand the difference between the different nodes. And by the way, mine is set up weird. So if you're somebody wondering why my software is a little different, I work with my straight nodes being the primary, and that's not normal, but it's what I've gotten used to over the years. So you'll see I have straight nodes, I have a curve node so that the next node will curve through. We get a cusp node, and then I can put a corner in there, but still have a curve on one side if I want it. If you start to understand how those nodes work, it's really fast to place and then edit those nodes where you need them. And in fact, I did this and just did it kind of quickly to make sure I didn't have to go back and do editing. You can even place much fewer nodes if you start to understand how these nodes work. You can say this line is really 3 nodes. I go back here. I need a transition point here and here. And I go close that up. And then I can go ahead and say, all right, pull this here, pull this here, pull this here, set that kind of inclination in a way that gives me that transition and that S curve. I don't even have to have the number of nodes that I used to get something quite useful. If you develop that skill, it can often be a lot faster to draw 3 shapes than to take that shape that you have and then try and convert it. Or you're going to notice like, oh, I want a satin stitch that goes around the outside edge. Oh, wait, it's a one line here. And then it's another line that's here. Wait, what's this line? Oh, that's separate also. It's a detail piece. It's not even part of this piece that's here. You end up where the things that you're seeing in the art, even when you have vector, are just so far from what you need that trying to edit down a vector shape is just not a useful thing to do. What you really want to do for most of the time when you're digitizing, especially if you want to do something interesting, where you have like these over and under shapes, where you're trying to do some carved detail like I showed you in this. Now I separated that out and killed my design temporarily. But when you're trying to overlap different pieces, and some of this line work is fine, but when you're dealing with, like, you want these different breaks, even in the fills, where you want multiple different objects so that you get different angles of reflection in the light, it's a lot faster to draw this stuff than to take the original vector and try and force it into that space. I mean, let alone anything that's more detailed. The lace piece really isn't neither here nor there. But there are plenty of pieces where we have that kind of carved work, even with really simple pieces, where you might want to have something else there. Now, even the black work, though, often it's just as easy to draw the stuff instead of trying to convert it. Because when this is drawn for print, the other thing you're going to find out is that sometimes things are drawn as objects and sometimes they're not. Or you're going to have places where this is one line, and if I trace that once, that's fine. But if I do that to both of these pieces, I assign stitches to both of them, suddenly I have an area around this one piece that is of one thickness. And even if I try and use a double line, so it's 2 thicknesses, now that's going to be against this piece that still has this connecting line up at the top, and means that we're going to have multiple passes in that same area, and I'm going to have to figure out how to get them connected. Whereas if we look at this piece here, and if we especially play it back, you'll find that it's much more controlled and that everything is interconnected as one filament of thread, and that the individual objects, when we're dealing with black work, are not that important. Black work and engraving work, we don't worry about objects. We worry about how many times we pass over a line. And in this case, I'm very controlled about how many times I passed over each one of those lines. Each one of those lines only gets 2 passes over it so that we get a uniform thickness of thread throughout the piece. Now, sometimes you can also use that to your advantage. When we're talking about, I did the same thing over here with that other piece. The Pitney brooch piece actually has some areas where I did double outline. I doubled outline these lines and then here so that that spine line is darker. the spine of this animal, you can kind of see the eye here and the head. And of course, there's this other beast that's biting its neck. This line is darker along the spine of that animal than you would have in the rest of the design. So you can actually run more times over an area if you want to on purpose to get the lines thicker, but it's a choice that you're making. And when you're doing that conversion style work where you just bring in a vector and start converting, you might not have that. The other thing about that is I showed you in the line work terms, if you're doing this with blocks of color, let's say we have a field of color. Let's say like our quarter horse head that's right above my shoulder, and I'm doing it incorrectly. There it is. It's backward to me for the camera, obviously. This quarter horse head is outside of these three pieces of blue. If I had that horse head punched out of a blue circle that's inside of this piece, you can imagine that if the edges of the designs are just touching each other and I punch them through and filled one color and then the other color, then as the pull distortion happens, they're going to pull away from each other. And depending on the stitch angle, it pulls on one angle and pushes on the other. Even if I just turn on pull compensation, I haven't dealt with push compensation, and I might see problems with that. You're not drawing for embroidery when you do this conversion work. And so it's very much like being on autopilot using auto. Conversion can result in things like that, even with simple shapes, even with stuff like the quarter horse, where it really is just a completely standard silhouette punched out of a color. Now, honestly, looking at this piece, those three circles also should not be connected. Those three parts of that blue circle are not one piece, because that's another thing I've seen people do when they're working from original print art is there'll be this horrible little line of blue snaking along the back underneath the neck of this horse because they've punched it out of a blue shape, and it's not three multiple pieces. It's actually, in this case, four, because there's a little notch between the ears there that's blue in that background. It's one circle that's now underneath this other border that's done on this piece. And that can cause kind of issues with that same thing. It's the concept of that shape of working like you do in Illustrator, and realizing that unlike Illustrator, unlike print, unlike digital, if we hide objects behind other objects, if we slap things together that look like they are a border, but they're actually a slab on top of a slab with a reveal, any shape that is filled with stitches has real stitches in it, and it's not punching it out. It's not imagining that it shouldn't be there and taking it out at the machine. It's going to run anything that's full of stitches. And if it's not full of stitches, if it's not compensated, it's not going to work, and it's going to have gaps in it. And that's the thing. It's about the other problem, the last problem that I'm going to cover today, which is just something I call forgetting the physicality. And all embroiderers do it to some degree, especially young digitizers do it. Older digitizers don't tend to, but can sometimes do so. You get to this point where you stop thinking about thread and fabric. You stop thinking about working on a garment, especially if you're somebody who's working for digitizing, who's outsourced, and you're not doing any work yourself. You may not be in the mindset of thread and of tension, of stabilizer, and of watching the needle go through the garment. And you can forget the physicality. Certainly people who come from other disciplines and are starting into embroidery forget this all the time. They don't think about punching a needle through things repeatedly and having things under tension. And also that the tension of the hoop makes a difference on how much the garment moves, that the strength and ability to resist distortion of the stabilizer makes a difference to how things run and look and the shape that they are when they finish running. But forgetting the physicality can really be a big deal, and it can cause a lot of harm to your eventual designs. And that's something that you just have to think about. It's like, yes, this is a very physical medium. And frankly, it's not something that you're going to be able to get away from. You are always going to be poking needles through garments. You're always going to be laying thread on top of textures. And you're going to have different results when you do that on different materials. They're going to behave differently under those stresses. So it's one of those things I always say is like, hey, this is something that has to be thought of. Materials matter. And if we don't think about the sample materials that we're running on, if we don't think about the physicality of thread, and honestly, the physicality of the movement of the machine on top of everything else, this can be difficult for us to get a handle on. And we end up where we don't deal with texture appropriately, we don't deal with the thickness of the material appropriately, and we don't end up with the results we could have if we had kept the physicality of the thing in mind. The other place this can happen, honestly, is when people are doing processes like applique or patch making, things like that, and they'll just forget things like, if I absolutely perforate the outside edge of something on a piece of plastic on a machine and keep running in circles and circles and don't think about how many holes I'm putting in that plastic substrate, it will eventually tear out on me and I won't have thought about that. And that is one of those things we have to think about. It's just invariably, this is a material thing. This is a physical process that is going to cause stress and that acts differently depending on the kinds of materials that we run. If we run on a towel, if we run on a piqué polo shirt, if we run on twill, we're going to have very different results. You can't embroider the same way on bridal tulle as you do on a sweatshirt and expect that it's going to be the same. And honestly, there are weird things that come and bite people. The one I've seen get people who are more in the kind of space of dealing with more like commercial stuff. You've been in there for a long time. Where they tend to drop the ball on this one is stuff like sublimated materials. It's just a big thing where you forget that when you're running on sublimation, they're like, all right, there's a halo around my design. Why is the bobbin coming up? What's this problem? And there's people who've done lots of embroidery who forget about this. But sublimation, if you think about sublimated polyester, sublimation is done on white polyester primarily, because other colors, yes, you can make them darker, but you can't make them lighter. And you're going to multiply whatever it is that you have with the color. It's going to mix with the color of the garment itself. So it's done on white polyester. So you'll have like a sublimated camo hat. Somebody will run a design through it, and suddenly there's a white halo. What you're seeing is, though we do impregnate the top layer of the polyester with dye when we print sublimation prints on garments, when we sew through them and pull on that with the tension of our thread in embroidery, it reveals a little bit of the white material underneath the dyed material on the top. And it's one of those things that it's a physical thing until you see it, until someone shows you that result. It's hard to picture that if you're not very aware of the physicality of the needle and the thread, and also how sublimation works to a degree, how embroidery works to a degree. You may not really kind of grok that. You may not understand that on a lower level if you don't think about that kind of issue. You don't think about the physicality of that thing. It may not make as much sense to you. And it's something that I think is worthwhile to think about no matter what we're doing. In fact, it really plays into everything else we talked about today. Working small. It's about people forgetting entirely about how small those stitches can be, what the machine can do, and not understanding that we're working against this point. We're not going to end up being able to do something at a certain small size. We forget when we're working too small. Too much density, very similar. We're not thinking about how thick thread is and that it's a physical object. Also, working small and drawing small. We don't think about the fact that we're using straight stitches to approximate a curve when we're making these pieces. And so it's something that really kind of gets past us if we don't think about the physicality of this thing. But the other thing that is part of that too is to remember that we're on a machine. And if you don't think about how the machine moves and how it forms stitches and what it's doing to a garment, the fact that we're controlling that machine with our digitizing, we can actually lose things like sequencing. We can get ripples in our garment because we don't think about the direction of the apparent movement of the material. We don't think about how we're pushing material along with the direction of stitching as we keep that presser foot slamming down into it. And we don't think about things like working on 3D foam, where you might put too much stitching on it, put too much underlay or travel stitching on it, and crush it down before we get our top stitching on it. We don't think about that physicality of the compression of the foam. All of this is done in the real material world, and we're doing kind of fairly violent things to all these materials. Forgetting that physicality can also set us up for bad results. So with that, folks, we are way into the bonus time. We've done a long one for sure, but these are the perennial digitizing problems I wanted to cover, right? Let's go ahead and go through them fast. Cutting out communication. You got to talk to people about what's important to them, both artistically and technically. Understand what a garment's supposed to do, what's important to a customer about their art, and how it's supposed to be viewed. Working small. Be careful being too zoomed in. If you don't have grids up, if you don't understand how small you're working, you're going to get too tight, too much detail in that area. And also understand that we're dealing with the limitations of stitch length. When you do really tiny curves, things like that, we're approximating those as straight lines, and you need to understand that sometimes it's better to control those with straight stitches, even though the line we're trying to get is a curve. We may be trying to hint at that curve with our straight stitches, and taking control is the better option. Excess density, try a lighter hand. Do some swatch testing if it makes sense to you. And when we're working on small detail, very similar to working small, think about how many threads and how many penetrations we're putting in a small area. How many times are we driving that needle through and leaving thread behind? How close together things are, even if they're outlines or engraving style work or black work. And do we have enough space for that to breathe? Believing the screen lies to you. It wants you to fail. It is always going to lie to you. The produce of a digitizer is the embroidery, not the file. Going on autopilot, automatic tools can be helpful for some things. I love the automatic patch tool that we have in our patch artist. We have the ability to do some automation that's cool. I love the automatic knockdown stitch that Enthusiast has for folks who aren't going to digitize but need to put things on a high pile garment. Those are automations that work, but automation that's about your creativity and your technical nature of how a design runs, it isn't there yet. Conversion thinking, just because you have clean vector doesn't mean you have everything you need for embroidery. It might make more sense to draw your shapes than convert them. And in fact, on detailed stuff, on stuff that you want texture, on things that you want to carve, you're going to be drawing. Let yourself get used to that and try not to slip back into the point of, man, I drew this once for vector. Why am I going to draw it again for embroidery? Well, because those shapes aren't the same shapes and this art isn't the same art. It's a new interpretation. And last but not least, forgetting the physicality. This is a thing that we do with needles and thread and stabilizer and fabric, and we do it fast, and we put thousands upon thousands of needle penetrations and threads through a garment that is already full of fabric. It's already full of threads. Understand what we're doing. Think about this thing on the micro scale, and it will make your designs look better at the macro scale. All right, folks, with that, thank you guys for being there. Have a great weekend. Hey, one more tip here that I love from City King, always true. Good to use your stitch player and really watch. Replay your designs digitally before you run them. And if you have a good design, you want to know how it works, replay that thing and analyze it. All right. With that, folks, I'm going to let you go for the weekend and get on to the other work I need to get done. But I hope to see you back again. And hey, it's not a mistake if we learn something from it. Failure is not fatal. Only giving up is the end. If we decide to soldier on and try again, the chances are we're going to get somewhere better. And even if we don't, there is good in the trying. All right, folks, thank you for being here. And I can't wait to see you again next week.